You didn't forget these cartoons. They were taken from you. Some aired for barely a season, others vanished without explanation. So why do they still feel so vivid and so incomplete? In the 1990s, sci-fi action cartoons were darker, riskier, and sometimes too intense to survive. This isn't a nostalgia trip. It's a recovery mission, because by the end of this video, you'll realize some of these shows didn't fail. They were quietly erased. Exosquad 1993. It didn't feel like a cartoon. That's the first thing people remember, if they remember it at all. Exosquad dropped you into a war already in progress, with no hand-holding, no easy heroes, and no clear sense that things would turn out okay. Humanity wasn't fighting monsters, it was fighting its own creation. The Neo-Sapiens weren't just enemies, they were a reflection of human arrogance, engineered to serve, now rising to dominate. And the battles? They weren't flashy for the sake of spectacle. They felt tactical, cold, personal. Pilots climbed into exoframes knowing they might not come back, and sometimes they didn't. Characters disappeared, sacrifices stuck, consequences mattered. That alone made it dangerous for its time. But what truly set it apart was its willingness to explore uncomfortable ideas: slavery, rebellion, loyalty, and the cost of war. It trusted its audience to think, to question, to sit with moral ambiguity. And maybe that's why it didn't last, because Exosquad wasn't built for easy consumption. It was built to linger, to unsettle. And once it was gone, nothing quite replaced it. Invasion America, 1998. It arrived like an event and disappeared like a secret. Backed by Steven Spielberg, Invasion America should have been unavoidable. A full-scale alien invasion, cinematic visuals, serialized storytelling, it had everything. But what made it unforgettable wasn't the spectacle, it was the tone. This wasn't a playful alien encounter or a simple good versus evil story. It felt closer to a slow collapse. The invaders weren't chaotic, they were strategic, patient, and disturbingly calm. Governments didn't have answers, systems didn't hold, and at the center of it all was a boy who didn't fully understand what he was becoming. That uncertainty carried through every episode. There was no safety net, no guarantee that things would reset by the next week. And for audiences used to self-contained stories, that kind of continuity felt almost unsettling. Then, suddenly, it was over, quietly. No long run, no cultural dominance, just a memory that feels bigger than the time it was given. And that's what makes it linger, because it never got the chance to fully reveal what it was building toward. Roughnecks, Starship Troopers Chronicles 1999. At first glance, it looked like a technical experiment. Early CGI, rigid character models, something that hadn't quite caught up to its ambition. But if you stayed with it, Roughnecks revealed something far more structured and far more intense. Inspired by Starship Troopers, it didn't chase satire or shock value. It leaned into the grind of war. Campaign after campaign, mission after mission. Soldiers weren't heroes, they were resources, deployed, tested, and sometimes lost without ceremony. The series adopted a serialized deployment arc structure, which made every battle feel connected, every loss cumulative. You weren't just watching action, you were watching attrition. And that slow erosion of certainty created tension that didn't rely on constant explosions. It relied on inevitability, on the sense that no matter how skilled the team became, the war itself wasn't something they could win cleanly. And then, just as it began to find its rhythm, it vanished. Budget constraints, production challenges, a story left incomplete. And maybe that unfinished feeling is exactly why it still lingers, because it never gave you closure, only momentum cut short. Hypernauts, 1996. It didn't look like anything else on television at the time. Hypernauts wasn't animated, but it belonged in the same conversation because what it attempted felt just as ambitious. A group of young explorers navigating deep space, encountering alien civilizations that weren't simplified or softened for easy understanding. Communication was uncertain, intentions were unclear, and that unpredictability created a quiet tension beneath every encounter. This wasn't about constant combat, it was about contact. About what happens when you step into a universe that doesn't revolve around you. The pacing was slower, more deliberate, and for some viewers, that made it easy to overlook. But beneath that surface was something rare, a show willing to treat space not as a playground, but as a frontier filled with unknown rules. It asked its audience to stay patient, to observe, to think. And in a decade driven by faster, louder storytelling, that restraint may have worked against it. Because while others grabbed attention instantly, Hypernauts built something gradually and disappeared before most people realized what it was doing. Phantom 2040, 1994. It wasn't just futuristic, it was suffocating. Phantom 2040 didn't present the future as exciting or full of possibility. It presented it as controlled, monitored, owned. Corporations didn't just influence the world, they defined it. And in the middle of that system was a reluctant hero carrying a legacy he didn't fully understand. This wasn't a power fantasy. It was a burden. The Phantom wasn't trying to save the world in a single moment. He was trying to navigate a system designed to resist change entirely. That's what gave the show its edge. The threats weren't always physical. They were structural, embedded, and that made every victory feel temporary, almost fragile. Visually, it leaned into a darker, cyberpunk aesthetic, muted tones, heavy shadows, environments that felt dense rather than open. But it was the writing that made it stand out. It didn't simplify its conflicts. It let them exist in gray areas where solutions came with consequences, and maybe that complexity made it harder to sustain. Because Phantom 2040 wasn't built for quick resolution, it was built to question everything and then leave you sitting with the answers. Bucky O'Hare and the Toad Wars, 1991. It looks ridiculous until you actually pay attention. A green space rabbit leading a crew across the galaxy shouldn't feel intense. But Bucky O'Hare hides something beneath its surface that most people missed the first time. This wasn't just colorful chaos. It was structured conflict. A full-scale intergalactic war against the Toad Empire. A regime that didn't feel cartoonish once you noticed how it operated, systematic, expanding, and disturbingly efficient. Entire planets weren't just attacked, they were converted, stripped of identity, turned into extensions of the Empire itself. That idea alone gave the series a strange weight. And then there was the pacing. It didn't linger. Missions moved quickly, threats escalated fast, and there was always a sense that the crew was reacting to something bigger than themselves. You weren't watching isolated adventures. You were watching fragments of a war that kept moving, whether you were there or not. That's what made it feel alive. But that same energy may have worked against it. It demanded attention. It assumed you'd keep up. And when audiences didn't fully lock in, it faded faster than it should have. What remains now isn't just nostalgia. It's the feeling that this universe had far more to show and simply ran out of time to prove it. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, 1993. It shouldn't have worked. That's the strange part. Advanced technology, mixed with prehistoric creatures, layered onto a post-apocalyptic Earth. On paper, it sounds like chaos. But Cadillacs and Dinosaurs didn't play it like a gimmick. It treated its world seriously. Civilization had already collapsed. Humanity had retreated underground. And when it returned to the surface, it found something unexpected. Not emptiness, but a world that had rebuilt itself without them. Dinosaurs weren't just obstacles. They were part of a restored ecosystem, something ancient reclaiming space from something that once dominated it. That tension sat quietly beneath the action. Because every conflict raised a question. Who actually belongs here now? The humans trying to rebuild, or the world that has already moved on? The show didn't always answer that cleanly, and that ambiguity gave it weight. Even the villains weren't purely destructive. They represented different ways of trying to control a world that refused to be controlled. Add to that a grounded, almost dusty visual style, and the result felt heavier than most cartoons of its time. But it didn't last. Maybe because it refused to simplify itself. Maybe because it asked questions instead of delivering easy victories. Either way, it disappeared, leaving behind a concept that still feels strangely ahead of its time. Double Dragon, 1993. Most people remember it as a simple adaptation, two brothers, martial arts, crime fighting. But the version that aired in the 1990s wasn't that straightforward. Double Dragon leaned into something more unstable. A city on the edge. Technology blending with mysticism. Power that didn't feel earned, it felt inherited, unpredictable, and dangerous. The dragon powers weren't just upgrades. They changed the characters, amplified them, and sometimes distorted them. That unpredictability created tension that went beyond physical fights. Because the real question wasn't whether they could win, it was what they might become in the process. The villains weren't just criminals either. They were extensions of the same world products of a system already fractured, and that gave every confrontation a slightly darker edge. Even the tone felt inconsistent in a way that made it more interesting. Moments of humor would break through, but they never fully erased the sense that something was off beneath the surface. And maybe that's why it struggled to stick. It didn't commit fully to being light or dark. It existed somewhere in between, shifting constantly. But that's also what makes it worth revisiting, because beneath its reputation is a version of Double Dragon that tried to be more than just action. It tried to explore what happens when power isn't fully understood and can't be controlled. Battletech 1994. This wasn't just about giant robots. That's the misconception that kept Battletech from reaching a wider audience. Yes, there were massive machines, towering, destructive, built for war. But the real focus wasn't the machines. It was the structure behind them. Political factions, strategic decisions, a constant balancing act between power and survival. Battles weren't random, they were calculated, and every move carried consequences beyond the battlefield. The series introduced a dual visual style traditional animation for personal moments, CGI for combat, which at the time felt experimental. But that shift did something interesting. It separated emotion from action, made the battles feel colder, more mechanical, less about heroism and more about execution, and that aligned perfectly with its tone. Because Battletech didn't present war as exciting, it presented it as necessary, controlled, sometimes even detached. Characters weren't chasing glory, they were managing risk, and that subtle difference gave the show a maturity that many viewers weren't expecting. But it also made it harder to market. It wasn't loud enough to grab attention instantly, and it wasn't simple enough to follow casually. So it slipped through, quietly, leaving behind a series that understood something most didn't, that war isn't defined by its scale, but by the systems that sustain it. Wing Commander Academy, 1996. It begins like a training story. That's the setup. New recruits, rivalries, lessons. The kind of structure you expect to build toward something bigger. But Wing Commander Academy doesn't rush that process. It lets tension grow slowly through competition, through mistakes, through the quiet realization that training isn't preparation. It's a filter. Not everyone is meant to make it through. And that understanding sits beneath every episode. The Kilrathi threat looms in the background, never fully disappearing, always reminding you that this isn't a game. And when conflict finally arrives, it doesn't feel sudden, it feels inevitable. What makes the series stand out is how it treats progression. Skill isn't instant, trust isn't automatic, and leadership isn't given, it's tested. Again and again. The characters evolve, but not cleanly. They struggle, they hesitate, and sometimes they fail. That's what gives the story its weight, because the stakes aren't just about winning a battle, they're about becoming someone capable of facing one. But like many shows of its kind, it didn't get the time it needed. It built its foundation carefully and then ended before it could fully pay it off. And what remains is that unfinished arc, the sense that everything was just beginning to come together right before it stopped. Project G.E.E.K.E.R. 1996. At first, it feels chaotic, loud, unpredictable, almost like it doesn't want you to take it seriously. But that's exactly how Project G.E.E.K.E.R. hides what it's really doing. Beneath the absurd humor and rapid-fire energy is a concept that's far darker than it appears, a bioengineered weapon that doesn't fully understand itself, drifting through a universe that sees it as either a tool or a threat. G.E.E.K.E.R. isn't a traditional hero. It's unstable, reactive, capable of incredible power, but without the clarity to control it. And that unpredictability creates a tension that never fully disappears, even in its most comedic moments. The supporting characters don't stabilize the world. They complicate it further, each one carrying their own motives, their own agendas. What looks like randomness begins to feel intentional, like the chaos is part of the design. And that's what makes it stand out. Because while other shows simplified their worlds, Project G.E.E.K.E.R. embraced disorder. It trusted the audience to keep up, to find patterns inside the noise. But that trust came at a cost. It wasn't easy to follow casually. It demanded attention, even when it looked like it didn't. And when audiences didn't fully commit, it slipped away, quietly, leaving behind something that feels incomplete, not because it failed, but because it never slowed down long enough for everyone to realize what it actually was. Vortekch, Undercover Conversion Squad, 1996. It starts like a familiar setup: teenagers, secret missions, advanced technology. But Vortekch doesn't stay simple for long. The threat isn't external in the way you expect. It's invasive, biological, mechanical, something that doesn't just attack, it transforms. Victims aren't just defeated, they're converted. And that single idea shifts the entire tone, because now every encounter carries a different kind of risk. It's not about losing a fight, it's about losing identity. The team isn't just protecting the world, they're trying to contain something that spreads, adapts, and evolves faster than they can predict. And the technology they use? It doesn't feel like a clean solution. It feels experimental, temporary, like they're constantly one step behind a problem they barely understand. That uncertainty creates a quiet pressure throughout the series. Even victories feel unstable, like they might not hold. Visually, it leans into transformation metal, merging with flesh, systems overriding control. Subtle enough to pass standards, but unsettling if you look closely. And maybe that's what made it difficult to sustain. It wasn't loud enough to define itself as horror, but it wasn't light enough to feel safe. It existed in that uncomfortable middle ground. And over time, that made it easier to overlook. But the idea it introduced, that the enemy doesn't destroy you, it replaces you, still lingers long after the episode's end. The Botsmaster, 1993. Control is the illusion. That's what the Botsmaster builds toward, even if it doesn't say it directly. On the surface, it's about a young genius commanding a fleet of specialized robots, pushing back against a powerful corporation. But the deeper you go, the more that dynamic begins to shift. Because the machines aren't just tools, they have personality, autonomy, and in some cases, a sense of judgment. And that creates friction. The hero isn't just fighting an external system, he's managing an internal one, trying to maintain control over something that isn't entirely controllable. Meanwhile, the corporation he opposes doesn't rely on brute force alone. It uses structure, surveillance, influence, a network that extends far beyond direct confrontation. That contrast, chaotic individuality versus controlled uniformity, gives the series its tension. Every conflict becomes more than a battle. It becomes a question of which system is more stable, which one lasts. And that's where it becomes unexpectedly heavy, because stability doesn't always align with freedom. Sometimes the controlled system wins simply because it's harder to disrupt. That idea sits quietly beneath the action, shaping every outcome. But it's also what made the show harder to digest. It didn't simplify its themes. It let them exist, unresolved. And in doing so, it became something more complex than its format could easily support, something that stayed just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. Space Strikers, 1995. It looks like competition, fast-paced, high energy, built around futuristic sports. But Space Strikers isn't really about winning. It's about control of space, of technology, of perception. The arenas aren't just playing fields. They're engineered environments, designed to push competitors beyond their limits, to test not just skill, but adaptability. And the opponents? They're not equal. Each one represents a different system, a different approach to power. Some rely on precision, others on aggression, others on manipulation. And as the series unfolds, it becomes clear that the matches aren't isolated events, they're part of something larger. A structure that uses competition as a way to measure, to evaluate, to select. That underlying purpose gives every match a different weight. Because losing doesn't just mean defeat, it means falling out of a system that may not let you back in. Visually, it leans into speed, sharp movements, shifting perspectives, constant motion. But beneath that is a quieter tension, the sense that everything is being observed, recorded, judged, and that pressure never fully lifts. It stays in the background, shaping every decision. But like many experimental concepts, it struggled to define itself clearly. Was it sports? Sci-fi? Strategy? It tried to be all of them, and in doing so, it became something harder to categorize and easier to forget. Surfer Strikeforce, 1995. It feels fast. That's the first impression. Motion, speed, constant elevation. Heroes riding jet-powered boards through the sky, chasing a villain who always seems one step ahead. But Surfer Strikeforce isn't just about movement, it's about imbalance. The team operates with precision, coordination, advanced tools, but their enemy doesn't follow the same rules. Cybran isn't just a threat, he's a disruption. Unpredictable, adaptive, always shifting the terms of engagement. And that creates a pattern. The heroes respond, they adjust, they try to contain, but they never fully control the situation. And over time, that repetition builds something subtle, a sense that they're not closing the gap. They're maintaining it, preventing something worse, but never truly resolving it. That's what gives the series its underlying tension. Because victory isn't defined by defeat, it's defined by delay, by keeping things from collapsing entirely. The visuals reinforce that idea: open skies, wide spaces, but no real sense of stability. Everything is in motion, constantly shifting. And that lack of grounding mirrors the story itself. It never settles. It never fully concludes. It just keeps moving until it stops. And when it does, it leaves behind a strange feeling. Not of completion, but of interruption, like something that was meant to continue simply didn't. Some of these shows didn't end. They just stopped. No finales, no closure, just silence. And maybe that's why they still stay with you, unfinished, unresolved, almost waiting to be remembered again. Because once you look closer, it becomes clear. The 1990s didn't just create these worlds, it left some of them behind.